Intel was supposed to be Oregon's insurance policy, the company that built Hillsboro into a global chip-making hub that employed tens of thousands of Oregonians at wages that made the state's cost of living feel manageable, that anchored an entire regional economy around its campuses. That company just announced it is cutting thousands of jobs. Not trimming. Cutting. And Oregon's governor didn't stay quiet. Start with the scale, because the scale demands it. Intel's Oregon operations are not a satellite office. The Ronler Acres campus in Hillsboro spans over 500 acres. The D1X Fab, the Aloha campus, the Jones Farm complex. Intel is woven into Washington County the way Nike is woven into Beaverton, except Intel's workforce skews toward the kinds of engineering and manufacturing jobs that actually sustain a middle class. Chip making isn't retail. It isn't gig work. It's the kind of employment that lets a family buy a house in Hillsboro, send kids to school in the Beaverton district, pay into Oregon income tax at rates that fund the state's budget year after year. Intel's Hillsboro footprint employs an estimated 20,000 people directly. The indirect employment multiplier, the coffee shops, the contractors, the suppliers, the daycare centers built around that workforce, pushes the economic impact dramatically higher. When a company of that size announces mass layoffs, it isn't just an HR story. It is a regional economic event. The announcement came against a backdrop that was already complicated. Intel globally has been navigating one of the most difficult stretches in its recent history. The company posted multi-billion-dollar losses across consecutive fiscal years. Its foundry ambitions, the plan to compete directly with TSMC by manufacturing chips for outside customers, ran into delays, cost overruns, and sustained skepticism from Wall Street. CEO Pat Gelsinger, who had staked Intel's turnaround on aggressive capital investment and a return to manufacturing supremacy, was removed by the board. The leadership team that replaced him arrived with a single overriding mandate: get the finances under control. The company that once defined what a semiconductor giant was supposed to look like was publicly recalibrating what it was willing to spend and where. Oregon was not immune to that recalibration. Reports emerged of hiring freezes, then restructuring, then the kind of language that precedes headcount reductions at scale. The $100 billion figure that had circulated in connection with Intel's U.S. expansion plans, partly tied to CHIPS Act ambitions, began to look less like a committed roadmap and more like a ceiling that was never going to be reached. Workers in Hillsboro started talking. Some posted to forums. Some began quietly updating resumes. The signals were visible to anyone paying attention. Then the layoff numbers arrived in public reporting, and the governor of Oregon responded in a way that made clear this was not being treated as routine corporate restructuring. Governor Kotek's reaction drew immediate attention. This is a governor who had already declared a statewide homelessness emergency on her first day in office and extended it. She had watched Portland's tax base and business environment deteriorate while the state's largest employers made decisions that Oregon had limited power to reverse. Intel's cuts hit differently because they weren't the result of a scandal, a policy failure, or a riot downtown. They were the result of Intel's own financial math, and Oregon had essentially positioned its entire regional economy around the assumption that math would keep working in the state's favor indefinitely. Kotek's public statements reflected a level of urgency that the governor's office doesn't usually apply to corporate restructuring news. She emphasized the human cost to workers and families across Washington County. She raised pointed questions about what the state had committed and what Intel had committed in return. She pointed to the CHIPS Act and the federal investment framework that had been used to justify confidence in Intel's Oregon future. And she made clear, on the record, that the state was not going to simply absorb this quietly and move on. That is not how governors typically talk about the restructuring decisions of private companies. The tone itself was a signal. That reaction matters because it tells you something about the fragility of Oregon's current economic position, a state that is simultaneously managing a homelessness crisis, a downtown Portland retail collapse, a strained relationship between its largest city and its neighboring counties, and now a seismic disruption to its most important private sector employer. That state does not have a lot of cushion. Intel's Oregon jobs were not just jobs. They were the tax receipts that funded state services. They were the professional salaries that made the housing market in Washington County function at a fundamentally different tier than Multnomah County. They were the reason Hillsboro had a different economic identity than Portland, and the reason Washington County consistently ranked among the wealthiest counties in the state. Here is the number that puts everything in context. Washington County's prosperity is not accidental. It is the downstream product of decades of sustained Intel investment. Chip-making plants require engineers. Engineers earn six figures. Six-figure earners pay Oregon's income tax, which reaches 9.9% at higher brackets, among the highest state income tax rates in the country. They buy homes. They spend locally. They attract supporting industries and services that fill in around them. Pull a significant portion of that workforce out of the picture, and you are not just disrupting individual families. You are rewriting the fiscal math that the county and the state have been operating under for a generation. The CHIPS and Science Act directed billions toward domestic semiconductor manufacturing with the explicit goal of rebuilding American chip-making capacity after decades of offshoring to Asia. Intel was the most prominent American beneficiary. Oregon was supposed to be one of the primary recipients of that investment. The political narrative was straightforward and powerful. Federal money, Intel expansion, Oregon jobs, national security through domestic chip production. The governor of Oregon didn't just observe that narrative, she participated in it. She used it in economic development messaging. She pointed to it as evidence that Oregon remained competitive at the highest levels of advanced manufacturing, even as other parts of the state's economy were showing stress fractures. When Intel's restructuring began to suggest the actual capital deployment would look nothing like the announced plans, that narrative didn't just get complicated, it collapsed. A governor who had built part of her economic credibility around Oregon's position as a global chip-making hub was left explaining to her constituents why the facility expansions weren't happening at the scale projected, why the jobs weren't materializing as described, and what the state intended to do about the workers already receiving separation notices. There are no clean answers to those questions. The gap between the promise and the delivery is now a matter of public record. The cuts don't exist in isolation. Oregon's economy has been losing ground across multiple fronts simultaneously, and the Intel news lands on top of a picture that was already deteriorating. Nike, headquartered just south of Intel's campuses in Beaverton, announced significant layoffs as it restructured under new leadership, roughly 1,600 positions cut. Adidas, with a major North American hub in Portland, trimmed its own workforce. The tech sector broadly contracted after the aggressive hiring surge of the early pandemic years reversed itself. Remote work reshaped where tech workers chose to live, and Portland's quality of life concerns, centered on visible homelessness, public safety perception, and the hollowing out of its downtown core, accelerated departures that might not have happened under different conditions. The city's commercial vacancy rates climbed. Retailers that had anchored downtown blocks for decades closed or relocated. What Intel's cuts add to that picture is a direct hit to the industrial economy, not just the knowledge economy. And that distinction matters enormously. Fab workers aren't remote. They can't take their jobs to Austin or Boise or Miami. The work happens at the facility. It requires physical proximity to equipment that costs hundreds of millions of dollars to install and can't be relocated. When those positions disappear in Hillsboro, they disappear from Oregon. The economic ripple is immediate, local, and structural in a way that a software sector layoff simply isn't. A software engineer who loses their job in Portland can find another one without leaving the state, or at least without abandoning the profession. A fabrication technician whose line gets cut doesn't have that flexibility. The state budget exposure compounds the problem. Oregon has no sales tax. The state's revenue model depends heavily on income taxes, and income taxes depend on the continued presence of high-wage earners. Intel's engineers and manufacturing specialists were exactly the kind of taxpayers that the model relies on. When that workforce contracts, the state's revenue base contracts with it. And in a state that is already navigating a significant shortfall in homeless services funding, the regional homeless services tax is burning through revenue faster than it collects it. With a 2030 expiration and no renewal plan in place, the loss of that income tax base isn't an abstract budget concern. It is a direct constraint on the state's ability to fund programs that are already underfunded. For everyday Oregonians watching this, the question isn't abstract. It's whether the state they live in, the one that extracts some of the highest income taxes in the country, and justified that for years with the promise of a robust public sector and a dynamic private economy, is still capable of delivering on either side of that deal. The homelessness crisis says the public sector isn't delivering. Intel's cuts say the private economy is contracting. The governor's reaction, urgent, public, pointed, says that at least at the executive level, someone understands that both things are happening simultaneously, and that Oregon does not have an obvious answer for either one. The workers in Hillsboro receiving separation notices right now are not abstractions in a policy debate. They are the people who made Oregon's economic story look credible. The engineers who bought homes and paid property taxes. The technicians who sent their kids to Beaverton schools. The contractors and suppliers whose businesses were calibrated around the assumption that Intel's Hillsboro campuses would keep operating at scale. None of them made a mistake. They built careers and lives around an employer that looked permanent. The employer's own financial math changed, and Oregon is left holding the consequences. The story of Intel in Hillsboro is the story of what Oregon bet on and what that BET looks like now that the numbers have shifted. $100 billion was the figure in the headlines. The figure that actually arrived was something smaller. And a lot of Oregon families are now living inside that gap.